First of all, I'd like to thank Maria for inviting me and thank everyone who's made this possible. This is a fantastic event to start off with, and I'm hoping this talk is going to be a very interesting launch for Creative Mornings in Belgrade. The reason that Maria asked me to come and talk was that I wrote an article for Kamenzind magazine about Savamala called 4 Species of Ghost. And the article was a psychogeography. And just very quickly, has anybody here heard the word psychogeography before? Nobody. Fantastic, a new idea. That's what these are all about, introducing new ideas. So psychogeography was a concept that was proposed by Guy Debord, the French situationist philosopher. And he was interested in different ways of viewing the city. One of the ways that he looked at the city was through psychogeography. And the idea with psychogeography is it's the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. So rather than looking at the physical aspects of the city, Debord proposed that we looked at the emotional aspects of the city, of the way that it influenced us, the way it made us feel. And that, for me, ties in with telling stories about the city, with the way that we live our lives in the city. So I wrote about Savamala because for me it's one of the most interesting areas of Belgrade. The reason it's interesting is because so many of the layers of Belgrade's history are here, like a cake, all piled on top of each other. And there's a tension in Savamala between the ugly and the beautiful. I think everyone would agree that Savamala is one of the most interesting parts of Belgrade, but it's also one of the ugliest, right? It's messy, it's dirty, it's noisy. There's a lot going on here, but it's very chaotic. But that's what gives it its character. So that, for me, is what I wanted to talk about a little bit, is this tension between the ugly and the beautiful that makes a city interesting. So we go back to psychogeography for a moment. This is Debord's map of Paris. Now, who's been to Paris here? I guess quite a lot of people. Does this look like Paris to you? Not much, right? Basically, what Debord did is he took the map of Paris, cut it up, and turned it around into a map that reflected how he experienced Paris. And so you end up with this, with these routes and these separate locations and the way they interact together. And this was another idea that Debord proposed for understanding the city, an idea called détournement. And Debord's idea was that you could take different ideas from different places and mix them up in ways that hadn't been done before and make something new and fresh. And that's really the start of what we can call remix culture, where you take different ideas from different places, combine them in new ways, and create something new. And I'd argue that all culture is remix culture now. We live in a world of remixing. And it makes it really interesting because you get all these, so in Savamala's case, you get all these different things up against each other, and the contrasts and the combinations create things that weren't there before. The thing is that in order to do a remix, you need to have existing materials. And that's where the city comes in. The city is an endless source of these kinds of materials. It's an endless supply of stories and images and ideas that you can use to develop your own concepts. So William Burroughs, the American writer, standing here in front of a danger sign in Paris, but not looking very dangerous. Burroughs had a technique which he called the cut-up. And he and his friends would take books, attack them with scissors, throw all the pieces in the air, and then rearrange the text into something new. Now, a lot of what came out of that was crap. Obviously, if you throw things randomly in the air, it's not always going to be coherent. But it was always interesting crap. And this technique of the cut-up, it very much reflects, I think, this remix culture. It's the next step in this remix culture. Burroughs said at one point, take a walk down a city street and put what you've just seen on canvas. You've seen a person cut in two by a car, bits and pieces of street signs and advertisements, reflections of shop windows, a montage of fragments. And the same thing happens with words. And I would like to propose that it's not just words, it's stories. As we walk through the city, we're intersecting with other people and with their stories. And for a brief while, we become part of their stories. We become part of this ongoing narrative that is the city. That's how cities are made. Now, I might be biased, right? I'm a writer. I like words, I like stories. But I think that most people who write about the city end up feeling this way, that it's composed of these stories. Another writer, Orhan Pamuk, the Turkish writer, standing here in Istanbul, the city where he's lived for his whole life, wrote, I'm reminded that what gives a city its special character is not just its topography or its buildings, but rather the sum total of every chance encounter, every memory, letter, color, and image jostling in the inhabitants' crowded memories after they've been living, like me, on the same street for 50 years. And so I'd like to say this is the first definition of the cut and paste city. This is the first version. It's the version which is made up of everybody's stories who live in the city, who have the chance to take elements of the city and make it their own, to make their lives their own. So psychogeography looks for traces of these fragments, these stories, because obviously stories are not visible in the world. You don't have stories walking along the street, you have people. But psychogeography looks for the traces, which are mostly invisible. Sometimes they're visible. Savamala, Belgrade more widely, is known for its street art. And here's a piece of street art with something put over it. You remember I wrote the article called 4 Species of Ghost. The title was inspired by this particular mural, Ghost People of Savamala, which I guess most of you have walked past, even if you didn't notice it. These are really interesting because of, again, the tension between the ugly and the beautiful. If you saw this mural in a gallery, it'd be nice, but it's not half as interesting as it is when it's placed onside a blank wall that's been blank for ages. The tension between the beauty of the mural and the ugliness of the fabric that it's been painted on creates something more interesting than just the mural by itself. Makes the mural more interesting. But any kind of graffiti does this. Often city authorities see graffiti as being an act of vandalism, but it's not. It's an act of storytelling. There's a classic book on graffiti that was published in 1999 called The Art of Getting Over. And the writer, Stephen Powers, pointed out, if you ever walked down the street and wondered what a marking meant, I'll tell you. It means somebody is telling you a story about who they are and what they're prepared to do to make you aware of it. So we can see in this kind of city hacking, in this kind of cut and paste approach, that people are telling their stories and making them visible to you. So one of the things that's really interesting about this kind of art is that it used to be that the only way you could experience it is by standing in front of it. You had to actually be there. Then the digital revolution comes along, the internet comes along, and suddenly this kind of art is everywhere. You paint this, take a picture of it, upload it onto Instagram, share it on Facebook, and suddenly some kid in Jakarta or Nairobi can experience this, maybe be inspired by it, maybe take a piece of it and put it into their city. So it's a way of distributing content that didn't exist before, of cutting and pasting from one city to another. But what it also does is not just distribute content. The internet actually distributes the city, because when you upload something, it becomes an abstraction. It becomes taken away from the city itself and put into this digital layer that we have going around the world. So one of the things that I think is interesting is this gives us new tools. One of the projects I've been involved with is the Belgrade Sound Map. The Belgrade Sound Map, every point on this map represents a field recording that somebody has made in Belgrade. It might be a market, it might be a street scene, it might be a conversation. But if you click on those points on the website, it plays the sound back. So this is very interesting. Here's Belgrade. But if I am sitting in Nairobi or Jakarta and I click on the map and it plays a sound, where is that sound? It's not in Belgrade anymore. It's not in my city. It exists somewhere else. It exists in this digital layer that extends our cities all the way around the world. But it also abstracts the city. It mediates the city. It turns the city into something digital itself. So these kind of digital tools, the possibility of the internet, creates these new ways of cutting and pasting city, of remixing the city. And it also creates the possibility for new moments of beauty. So this is really interesting. Can anyone guess what this is? Does anyone know what this is? Huh? Yeah. So it's a glitch from an Apple map. And what it's done is it's turned a city, perfectly nice city, I think this is from Stockholm, it's turned Stockholm into a waterfall. And I think this is really beautiful. But it's a glitch. It wasn't deliberate. It's an accident of the software. So you've got this moment of beauty, this moment of interesting strangeness. But no one made it deliberately. It happened through a fault. And for me, that's one of the problems with the digital city. The digital city tends to be very orderly. Computers don't like chaos. They like to lay things out in a very orderly way. And in some ways, that's very beautiful. But it takes away the opportunity for ugliness, for accidents to happen. And that makes it a lot less interesting. The result is that most digital cities tend to look like this. This is Grand Theft Auto, which is legendary for building these very huge cityscapes, which you can walk through and drive through and interact with people in. But they all look like this. They're not actually very interesting in and of themselves. They're nice to play a game in, but you really wouldn't want to live there. So one of the problems we now have is that the same tools that are used for building this kind of architecture belong to the family of the tools that we use for regular architecture, the same kind of 3D modeling, the same kind of mapping tools. So the result is that a lot of cities tend to look like computer simulations of cities. And this is obviously from SimCity, which is a computer simulation. But we have an example right here in Belgrade. We have a city which is essentially a computer simulation, which is really interesting, right? You have this computer-generated city, very orderly, very beautiful, completely digital, which people are proposing we should all go and live in. So the problem I have with this is very hard for me to imagine myself living there, in a digital city, in Grand Theft Auto's San Andreas. Nice place to visit, I wouldn't want to live there. So what kind of people live in this kind of city? So here's one of the publicity shops from Belgrade on the Water. It's a shopping mall, and it's filled with people. Now, there's a British artist called James Bridle, who's done a lot of work on this kind of cityscape. And he calls these people the render ghosts, the little people who live inside architectural renders. And what he said about them is the render ghosts are the people who live inside our imaginations, in the liminal space between the present and the future, the real and the virtual, the physical and the digital. A world of architecture, urbanism, and the city before it is built, which is also never. They inhabit a space which exists only in the virtual space of 3D computer rendering software projected onto billboards. So you have all these people having their little lives, and these are the perfect inhabitants for the digital city. They've literally been cut and pasted into that city. This is the other version of the cut and paste city. Before I talked about this artist's, this writer's, this philosopher's version, which consists of people taking their lives, their stories, taking elements from the city and combining them in new ways to build that city. That's one version of the cut and paste city. And this is the other version, a literal cut and paste city, where things are just cut and pasted onto the urban environment. And the problem that the city planners have with these kind of approaches is that people don't react very well to this kind of urbanism. People actually don't like it very much, and we've seen it time and time again. Rem Koolhaas, the architect, has lamented the loss of local architectural styles. He said, if you look back 100 years, you'll find there was still such a thing as Indian architecture, Thai architecture, Chinese architecture, African architecture, Dutch architecture, Russian architecture. But now, almost all these languages have disappeared and are subsumed in a larger and seemingly universal style. This often comes up in the Middle East. And for me, this is a good example of that. Obviously, the money for Belgrade on the Water comes from the Middle East, from Abu Dhabi, and the architectural style is very similar to that which you find in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and similar cities. Now, obviously, having said that, you might think I'm an enemy of Belgrade on the Water. But I actually quite like Belgrade on the Water. Because it only exists on the internet. I'm a writer, and this is a fictional city, an imaginary city, so I find it really fascinating. The other thing that I find fascinating about Belgrade na Vodi is that it's basically an advertisement for itself. All the images that you see are advertisements for Belgrade na Vodi. If you Google, this is what you get. There is no city yet. It's just the advertisement for the city. And this, again, is absolutely fascinating. One of my favorite writers, J.G. Ballard, who wrote Crash, amongst other novels, actually saw this coming way back in the 1970s and 1980s. And he wrote, "We live in a world ruled by fictions of every kind, mass merchandising, advertising, politics conducted as a branch of advertising, the preempting of any original response to experience by the television screen. We live inside an enormous novel." And that's what these big urban plans are. They're these fictional cities which are waiting for stories to happen in them. You also have this opposite approach. This is a British artist called Robert Montgomery, who rents billboard space in different places to put up his own slightly disturbing quotes and sayings to hack the city, essentially. This is very much in the tradition of Guy Debord and the Situationists, of introducing these new elements into the city space that surprise people, that create these new ideas. What I worry about is that these big planned cities that we have, these big 3D cities, these fictional cities, don't allow as much space for this kind of remixing, for this kind of cutting and pasting, as the historical city does, as the alternative does. I worry that they're more about control than about creativity. Koolhaas also said at one point about the smart city, where is the possibility of transgression? And I think that's a question we have to ask. You have this space within the city where people can do what they want, where their lives are not controlled, where they can break the law sometimes. I'm not saying you should break the law, but that possibility exists. And the more we move towards a city that's based on control rather than creativity, the more of that freedom we tend to lose. We need to get the balance right. So the question is, what's really the alternative? This is an example of ruin porn. Ruin porn is a genre of photography which takes old, deserted, decaying buildings and makes them aesthetically beautiful. And this is an example from Belgrade, from a blog called Yomadic. And the owner of that blog is slightly obsessed with Belgrade. It's his favorite city to travel in. And he has a number of very beautiful photos like this. This is an ugly space. I think everyone would agree. It's falling apart, it's decaying, it's dangerous, it's rusty. But there's an aesthetic there. There's the aesthetic that turns this ugliness into something beautiful. This, I think, is nice, but again, you wouldn't want to live in this ruin any more than you would want to live inside Grand Theft Auto. It's not a particularly nice space to be in. And I'm not saying that people should have to live in Savamala as it is. Clearly, something needs to change. We need to have development in order to have better quality of life. So, the alternative. Before I move to what the alternative might be, I'd like to go on holiday. I'd like to go on holiday to the island of Tanna in the Pacific. In the 1950s, anthropologists started to visit these Pacific islands and found some very strange things. They found tribes that had built scale models of airplanes and airstrips, including the control towers, goggles, headphones, and had these rituals around them, where they would perform these dances and these rituals. And the anthropologists were very puzzled. How did these come about? Where did they come from? And it turned out that these tribes, during the Second World War, their islands had been used as landing areas by American airplanes. And whenever the American airplanes came, they would bring technology, they would bring food, they would bring supplies, which the tribes had never seen before, the people had never seen before. So after those planes left, after the war was over, the tribes started to build copies of the planes in the hope that that would bring the planes back and bring the goods back with them. And they incorporated this into their spiritual practice, into their religious practice, in order to make it happen. And I worry sometimes that these 3D models, that these maquettes and the renderings start to occupy a similar kind of space, that we build them hoping that it's going to bring the things they promise, the investment, the jobs, the better quality of life. And it's very easy when you have these models to attach more meaning to them than they might have. We need to avoid that. We need to avoid mistaking the models for the thing itself. The reason why we need to do that is because it's not true that if you build it, they will come. And we have some really good examples of that. In China, there's a number of very huge urban projects where they're basically building entire cities from scratch, anticipating that the growing population is going to move into them and create new cities. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This is a shot from Ordos in China, which is basically dying before it even got started. They built an entire city and nobody wanted to live there. So I think at the moment Ordos has 10% occupancy and people are leaving rather than coming. So what you've basically got there is a work of art on a grand scale. It's a life-size architectural 3D model, and nobody wants to live in it. And there is a strange kind of beauty in that. You know, in the same way as ruin porn is very fascinating, these scapes are very fascinating. They're almost comparable to this kind of imaginary city. This is the French artist, Jean-François Rosier, who builds these very hyper-real but very strange cityscapes. And I don't know about you, I'd love to visit this, but living there would be a bit odd. Living in a place like Bourgh in China would be a bit odd. What's missing from these kinds of cityscapes, from Bourgh, from the ruins, are the people, of course. So this isn't an argument against planning. We need planning. We need to plan better urban environments. We need to plan better ways of life. But we need it to involve the people who are actually going to live there. Otherwise, of course, there's a danger that they might not turn up. I started out by saying that I wrote about Savamala because it's one of the most interesting parts of Belgrade. But Belgrade overall is fascinating to me. It's one of the reasons I live here is because it's a cut and paste city. It's like a collage of different architectural styles. When my friends say, what's Belgrade like? Is it really beautiful? They're imagining somewhere like the Old Town in Prague. And Belgrade isn't beautiful like that. I think Belgrade, objectively, is quite ugly. But that ugliness is what gives it character. That ugliness is what makes it an interesting place. And that's gone like that. So, we're going to run through. That's what makes it an interesting place. And so that's what I want it to be. And I think Belgrade is the perfect city for the 21st century precisely because of that. We live in a remix culture now. We live in a cut and paste culture. And Belgrade is really a cut and paste city. So if we take it back to the stories that we're telling, Belgrade has a really, really interesting story to tell. The question for me is who should be telling that story? I think the people who live in Belgrade should be telling that story. I think the people who live there should have the chance to remix their own city. Because the alternative is to have somebody else tell their story for them. Thank you very much.